Welcome back, everybody, to a preview episode of the Junkyard Dawgcast. I'm your host, Jordan Hill. I appreciate everyone tuning in, listening as we record this live on Thursday afternoon. And shout out to our guest today, Bama 24/7's Mike Rodak has joined us to get ready for a big game in Tuscaloosa on Saturday night. Number 2, Georgia going to Alabama to face the number 4 Crimson Tide. Two undefeated teams, two teams that have legitimate playoff hopes and promises to be a big-time game, 7:30 Eastern Time, 6:30 Central on ABC. And I want to bring Mike on and talk about this matchup, learn a little bit more about this Alabama team. And first off, Mike, I appreciate you taking the time to come on with us. And I'll ask, how's the weather over there in Alabama on this Thursday afternoon? Though throughout the Southeast, a lot of us kind of ducking and trying to stay dry these next few days.
I think we're on the good side of the storm, as James Spann, the famous weather guy here, always says, east is the beast and west is the best on a hurricane. So we're on the west side. It's going to be okay here. I think the game's going to be fine in terms of weather. I don't know if it'll affect Georgia's plans at all in terms of, getting over to Tuscaloosa. But for the game itself, at 70 degrees, 75 degrees, dry, and there might be a passing shower, but, nothing like what's going to be happening in Florida and Georgia the next couple of days.
For sure. And Kirby Smart talked about it a little bit on Tuesday, trying to figure out what the travel would look like. But like you said, Mike, it looks like for the game, it's going to be wide open. And definitely glad that, based on what we've seen as we record this on Thursday afternoon, weather's not going to be a factor. So, Mike, I brought you on, and I wanted to really let our listeners learn more about this Alabama team. I'm sure a bunch of them have watched them through this point in the season. But we have to start with, a new era for Alabama football with Nick Saban retiring, Jaylen Milroe coming over from Washington, and kind of an open-ended question for you, Mike. When you look at where this program is right now compared to, obviously, what Nick Saban had done at the helm of the program, what stands out to you as the biggest differences both on the field with Jaylen Milroe and also off the field?
Yeah, I'll start with off the field. I think it feels different around the building. I think everybody will tell you that, Nick Saban is Nick Saban, and he's like a different level of coach. He's just a different level of human being. He's so detailed. He's so regimented. He's so organized. Everybody who works for him, is all walking on eggshells all the time. I mean, that was always the feeling around the building because he's Nick Saban. You need to do things exactly right. It's really hard work working for him, but in the end, it's going to pay off because he's the best at what he does. And so that was always the vibe there. I think people were a little bit uptight. I think there was obviously a little bit of paranoia when it came to even watching practice the last couple of years. Saban didn't let us do that at all. Injuries, whatever. He didn't let freshmen talk. He didn't let assistant coaches talk. He didn't let coordinators talk other than once a year. It was just very tunnel vision from Nick Saban, where Jaylen Milroe is much more relaxed. He's younger, but a bit of a new school coach, if you will. I think he's more of a player's coach. Just doesn't have that kind of aura around him. And he's just kind of the normal everyday guy from next door who happens to coach Alabama football and be a really good coach, with his record and all the winning that he's done over the years at the NAIA level. And then, the last couple of years at Washington and Fresno State. So just, he's different. There's no doubt about it. I think people are more relaxed around him. I think his coaching staff is a little bit more relaxed. I still think there's a standard and kind of a level that he demands of people, but he does it in a different way. I think he wants to connect more with his players and, he gives out his phone number to players, which is something that Nick Saban didn't even do. We'll text guys. I think Snapchat has happened a couple of times with players where, they've snapped him. And it's just, again, it's a different vibe, and he wants to connect with players. He wants to kind of get them to trust him. And it's tougher too. When you're not Nick Saban, I think you have to get guys to kind of get behind you a different way. And he's done that. I think players are really rallying behind him. There's a group of players that were kind of the leaders of last year's team: Jaylen Milroe, Malachi Moore, Tyler Booker. And then when this transition happened, which every player was a surprise when Nick Saban retired, those were the guys that were saying, just let's wait it out. Let's see what the new coach is like. And I think they've been the ones that have been leading the charge for DeBoer in the locker room. And where this team is right now in September compared to where they were in the middle of January in terms of buy-in and guys just the good vibe among players, I think it's changed a lot because players were nervous. They were anxious. There's players who left through the portal. They didn't know what was going to happen in January, and everything just seems a little bit more settled now. So that definitely helps DeBoer's cause as well. And then on the field, I mean, DeBoer's system is very pass heavy in terms of what he has done historically. You look at Washington last year; they were second in the country in pass attempts, 574, I think they had with Michael Penix, and he was thrown for 400 yards the first 3 weeks of last season. This is not that. Like, they have had to shift their offensive philosophy to fit Jaylen Milroe, which is going to be a lot more running. And Jaylen Milroe has touched the ball more than any other ball carrier on Alabama. He has 36 touches this year. He's the centerpiece of this offense, but it's not just him chucking the ball a bunch of times. I mean, Alabama as a team has only thrown the ball 22 times a game, which is in the bottom 10 of the country. So it's the complete opposite of what DeBoer has done at Washington the last couple of years. But this is what they feel like they need from Jaylen Milroe, is just a different style of offense. So it actually looks similar offensively to what it was last year under Tommy Rees, because DeBoer has molded things that way and kind of adjusted his own scheme. And then defensively too, it actually looks similar to what Alabama was running the last couple of years. I mean, Kane Womack's 4-2-5 defense is somewhat what Nick Saban was running. Even though Saban's a base 3-4 guy, most of the time they were a nickel with 4-2-5 or 3-3-5. And you can there's some differences in the defense and in their philosophies, but you watch them line up and it's not night and day by any means. So I would say the differences are more off the field and just kind of the vibe and the culture of the building than they are schematically and on the field right now.
You can't really blame Kalen for looking at what they were doing and saying, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And I mean, that I think it makes sense. And we've seen it to this point work really, really well for Alabama. Mike, you mentioned Jaylen Milroe. Obviously, he's been probably the most talked about player, at least over here in Athens, getting ready for this game. Kirby Smart with a lot of complimentary things to say about Jaylen and what he's done with the Crimson Tide. What has stood out to you and how he's played to this point in his second season as a starter, and what areas do you think he still needs to work on going forward?
Yeah, I mean, it's really a continuation of what he did in the second half of last year, because his first half last year was rough. There's no doubt about it. He had the Texas game, had the 2 interceptions, got benched, came back against Ole Miss, did not look great, had another interception, kind of pulled that game out in the second half. Same thing against Tennessee. They fell behind. He didn't look great. And then it was really that LSU game where he outdueled Jaden Daniels in November that he kind of took off from there. He had the Kentucky game the next week. He was great. He had the Auburn game, which he played really well with the 4th and 31 play. Had the Georgia game, which was kind of his centerpiece. And the Michigan game, the Rose Bowl wasn't great for him. He had the fumble. That was an issue, but it wasn't, I want to say he lost them the game by any means, the Michigan game. And then he comes out this year and again, different offense, but it's been adjusted to him and doing a lot of the same things where the downfield passing is definitely a big part of his game. He wants to drive the ball down the field. He wants to take those deep shots. He has the arm to do it. And then he has that kind of knack to run. He wants to tuck it and run it. And when he does, he has a big playability every time because of his speed and because of his size. And that's kind of where this offense has been. It's been a lot of the big plays to Ryan Williams. It's been a lot of the big runs from Jaylen Milroe. And then it's just a question of what does the rest of it look like? Because it is a little bit of, you're pulling the handle on the slot machine. And if Ryan Williams is wide open, you're hitting it. And that's a big play. If Jaylen Milroe finds a seam and he goes 50 yards, like that's a big play. But the ability to kind of stack plays when those big plays aren't available, can you put together 2, 3, 4 plays in a row, move the chains, get the shorter passes, get the checkdowns going? Like that's, I think, what people want to see, what Kalen DeBoer wants to see more out of this offense. And the decision making too with the running, I think is still a big part of Jaylen Milroe, where if it's 3rd and 7 and he doesn't see his first read, sometimes he just wants to take off, but he may only get 3 or 4 yards, and then you're punting on 4th down. I think DeBoer wants him to say, go to your second read, go to your third read. If you find the guy open for 5 yards and 6 yards, you can get a first down, like go for that. Instead of trying to tuck it and run every time and distribute the ball to your playmakers. because I think they have better playmakers than what they had last year. I think Jermaine Burton was good. I think Isaiah Bond was good. Ryan Williams is great. Ryan Williams is an elite talent already as a freshman. He's by the end of this year, he's I think easily going to be considered one of the best wide receivers in America. Top 10 sort of prospect in this high school class, and that's better than what they've had the last couple of years. And you have to get the ball to him. So it's not just the deep shots; it's getting the ball to him in space, and he should have more catches right now than he does. And I think that's just what DeBoer talks about, is just finding that balance between Milroe using his legs and then him getting rid of the ball and getting the ball to other people.
Yeah, let's jump right into Ryan Williams. I'll be the 9 millionth person to mention that he's only 17 years old, but obviously he's been super impressive. He should only be a senior in high school right now. What has impressed you the most about what Ryan Williams has done to this point and what he brings to this offense?
Yeah, I mean, he's a summer enrollee, which at this day and age of college football, there's not too many players that are, and he kind of had to because of he was just a junior last year in high school. It's not like he could have enrolled halfway through his junior year, but even coming up as a late enrollee, he's stepped right in and basically became a starter from day one. I mean, he was out there in the first play of the first game. So that I think is impressive in and of itself, to just step in and learn an offense and be able to show coaches that you're mature enough and you know where to line up and you're not going to make mental mistakes, and they can trust you to be out there playing high level college football from, the first day of your freshman year and 2 months after you enroll in college. That in and of itself, I think, has impressed coaches. That's, impressed a lot of us. And then when he's actually gotten the ball, you can just see that smoothness to him, that natural catching ability, the ability to track the ball. There's speed there. He's just gotten open. He's been wide open for a few plays. Some of that might just be, I think it was Western Kentucky blew a coverage, and Wisconsin, I think he just beat it, guys. So, Devontae Smith is the comparison. That's the guy that I think people are going to bring up. For the most part, it's a similar size. He's a little bit smaller. He's like 175, and that might be generous. Whereas Devontae Smith was, pretty slight guy as well. But man, he can run. Both of them can run and get open. And Amari Cooper is the other one. I think Saban has brought up Amari Cooper as a comparison, but that's the sort of talent they have, and that's something they've been missing the last couple of years at Alabama. I mean, Jamison Williams, I think, was probably the last guy that felt like this, and he was only there for a year as a transfer from Ohio State. So they haven't really had a homegrown receiver until you go back to those Devontae Smith and Jerry Jeudy and Jalen Waddle, Henry Ruggs days, which, those are a few years back now. So that changes things. And I think he's going to be the best receiver on the field for either team on Saturday night. And if you can hit a few of those big plays that he's certainly capable of making, then, that changes the course of a game.
Absolutely. In Georgia, Kirby Smart, players talked all week about explosive plays, but then too with Ryan Williams, understanding he has the capability of making some of those plays. Mike, I want to admit to something when I talk about this Alabama team, and it's the run game. I have to admit, I just feel like I don't know very much about these guys, but Jam Miller, Justice Haynes, obviously Jaylen Milroe runs quite a bit. What have you seen from the ground game and how Alabama's been able to use it to this point, 3 games into the season?
Yeah, I mean, the volume hasn't been huge, and there's a couple reasons for that. Number one, Milroe likes to run the ball, and he's run the ball more than anybody else this season. So that's going to take some carries away from your backfield. Number two, the first couple games, they had some pretty explosive runs. And I think Justice Haynes had an 85-yarder. Jam Miller had a 30-something, 40-yard touchdown. And so you're not stacking together 2, 3, 4, 5 carries a drive. You're just going boom, one play, and you're scoring. And that's kind of, I don't want to say deflated their stats, but their number of carries just aren't there because they were scoring so quickly in that first game, especially the Western Kentucky game. And even Wisconsin, I think they had some pretty big plays, explosive plays, and that it's going to knock down your total numbers a little bit. So that's part of it. And I think they want, especially a game like this, I don't think they're expecting to be able to break an 85-yard run against Georgia. So they're probably going to need to grind it out a little bit more. I would say Jam Miller is, probably a little bit ahead of Haynes. I think Haynes could start, but Miller, I think, has done a little bit more so far this year. Haynes probably has the higher ceiling. He's a year younger, out of Georgia, out of Buford, a little bit higher recruit, but Miller's a little bit more dependable, the veteran, has broken a few big plays himself. So it's going to be a mix of both of those guys. And then at the end of the day, I think it still comes down to how much are they using them versus just giving the ball to Jaylen Milroe. And they've mixed in a decent amount of design runs where he just takes the ball and runs forward, and he's 6'2", 230, and he's going to run right through people. And that can be just as good as handing the ball off to Miller or Haynes. So as long as he doesn't get hurt, I think that's probably going to continue.
Yeah, Justice Haynes, a guy that Georgia fans followed in his recruitment. His father, Veron Haynes, played at Georgia. A lot of folks remember him in the early 2000s. So people will be paying attention to him, probably not rooting for him on Saturday, but obviously they're familiar with his game. Mike, who are some other skill players on this offense that Georgia fans should be aware of? Guys that, along with the running backs, along with Ryan Williams, along with Jaylen Milroe, have the potential to make plays on Saturday?
Yeah, I mean, the tight end position I don't think is really inclined to do much. I know there was some higher hopes this year that Kalen DeBoer's offense would sort of unlock the tight end position, but they're going to be blocking most of the time. So unless there's a random play that they try to go to one, I wouldn't expect a whole lot out of them. And they did have a touchdown it was Josh Cuevas, the Washington transfer tight end in the last game, but it's really going to be about the receivers outside of Ryan Williams. And I think the two biggest ones to know are Jeremy Bernard, who is a transfer from Washington. He played for Kalen DeBoer last year. In fact, he played at Michigan State before that. So he's kind of a journeyman wide receiver at this point. But he's their number two guy, if you want to say Ryan is the number one. And Bernard had a big touchdown against Wisconsin, the last time they played. And, there's some big playability from him as well. And then Kendrick Law is a really interesting player. The third-year guy who was used a little bit last year. You kind of saw some flashes out of him. I would be watching for him in terms of, screen passes, jet screens, kind of getting him lateral and kind of using his speed. I know there was a number that Kalen DeBoer brought to SEC Media Days that he hit like 23 miles an hour over the summer. He bench presses 400 pounds or something silly like that. Like he had some really crazy eye-popping stats about Kendrick Law that DeBoer mentioned over the summer. And I think people kind of got excited about him and said, ooh, this guy's really, going to do some big things. He has not been a huge part of the offense so far. He only has one catch, one carry through 3 games. And again, part of that just goes back to Jaylen Milroe kind of sucks the air out of the offense sometimes when he's carrying the ball 10, 15 times a game. And there's just not a whole lot of plays to go around. But I do think they want to get Kendrick Law more involved. I think he's kind of their number 3 guy right now. And in a game like this, I would certainly be alert if I was Georgia for some sort of not trickery, but something different from Kendrick Law, where he's moving lateral and they try to get him the ball that way.
Feels like we've seen a lot of jet sweeps just in football in general this year. So that is definitely a good point as far as something to keep an eye on. Mike, before we turn our attention to the defense, I do want to talk about this offensive line. Seemed like from the outside looking in, they struggled a little bit early in this year. What did you feel like were some of those early issues, and where do you feel like the line is going into this game?
Yeah, they had some injuries early on with Caden Proctor got hurt, kind of a freak injury in pregame warmups before the first game. So he was out for the first 2 games because of that. And Elijah Pritchett started at left tackle because of that. And then he got hurt in the first game and wasn't really 100%. And then they had to move Tyler Booker, who's a really good guard, to tackle for that second game. So there was a lot of moving parts, guys in different spots that they weren't used to. That hadn't played really in fall camp. Like Pritchett had been on the right side all fall camp, and all of a sudden 20 minutes before the game was playing left tackle. So that I think kind of threw a wrench into some things. And then they had Wilkin Formby, who was a younger player, very inexperienced player who was starting at right tackle for the first 2 games. And he had some problems with penalties and got beat a few times too. So they've kind of settled into, I think, what they want to be their starting line now, which has Proctor back on the left side, has Pritchett, who's a former 5-star prospect on the right. And then their interior, they really like. I mean, Tyler Booker is probably a first-round pick next year at left guard. Jaden Roberts could be a 2nd or 3rd-round pick at right guard. Parker Brailsford's a pretty good center that they've got from Washington. So it's a solid group on paper. They haven't played together a lot. They had a really good game at Wisconsin. It's going to be a different animal against Georgia's front. And it's going to come down to how does Pritchett hold up? And he's still pretty inexperienced himself. How does Proctor hold up on the left side? He had some bumps in the road last year, had a really good game against Georgia in the SEC championship game last year, but still probably has something to prove as a player himself. So, I think there's some cautious optimism, from Alabama fans about this line that they've finally settled into what it should be. But this is also a line that did not look great early in the year, as you mentioned. And it's a line that had some issues last year as well, giving up a lot of sacks, Jaylen Milroe. And part of that's probably Milroe himself, just in terms of holding the ball and, kind of working his way into pressure himself. But it's going to be a big deal. I mean, you give up 5 or 6 sacks and you turn the ball over, your chances of winning this game are going to be much lower than what they did last game, which was, I think, 1 sack, and they didn't turn the ball over at all. So there's going to be a big swing there. And if they can keep Milroe from getting sacked, if they can control the ball, I would much better like their chances to win this game.
Looking at the other side of the ball, Kane Womack coming over from South Alabama, running this defense. What do you feel like are the greatest strengths of this defense, and who are the names to know on that side of the ball?
Yeah, it's a veteran defense. As much as there was a lot of talk kind of in the offseason and at media days about how young they were in the secondary, I wouldn't say that's shown up at all. I mean, Malachi Moore is a 5th-year safety, and he's going to play in this game. He had a concussion against Wisconsin, but he's back. He's fine now. So he's actually moved from where he was under Saban. Saban, he was their slot guy, the star. He's actually moved to deep safety now for his last year of college football. And then they brought in Keon Sabb, a safety from Michigan, who's really been a big addition to this defense. Really mature guy, very instinctive safety, bigger guy, had 2 interceptions in the first quarter of the first game. And that safety combo, you talk about young and inexperienced. They're not. Like that's a great group right there. It's really the corner position that I think is the big question mark. Damani Jackson coming in from USC, former top 10 recruit. He's stepped in. He's looked the part. I mean, hasn't really shown up on the stat sheet, but that could be a good thing when you're a corner because you're not getting thrown at. And then, the other corner spot is really the biggest one to watch. I think that's the biggest area where Carson Beck and Mike Bobo are probably sitting down and thinking that they can exploit is that second corner spot. Xavier Brown's a freshman from the same high school, Mater Dei, in Southern California, who started the first couple games here. And there's been some moments where USF receivers got behind him and they just missed those throws. I don't think Carson Beck would miss those throws. So, they have to make sure that he's holding up because he's going to be what's viewed as the weak link in that defense. And then up front, I think it's a veteran group. There's a lot of 4th and 5th year guys up front, really experienced guys. Deontay Lawson, the middle linebacker, and Jahad Campbell's been around now for a while. Tim Smith, Jaheim Otis, Tim Keenan, Jamarian Latham, like all these guys have been around Alabama for a while. But are they game wreckers? They don't have a Will Anderson. They don't have a Dallas Turner. They don't have a Chris Braswell. Who's going to be the guy if it's 3rd and 8 and you need to stop late in the game against Georgia to step up and, get that sack or make that play? I would be a little bit less confident this year than I would have the last couple of years with some of the big time pass rushers that they've had. I think the biggest name to watch if you're a Georgia fan is going to be LT Overton, number 22. He's the former 5-star kid who's from Milton, Georgia, I think is where he lived because his dad's actually the AD at Kennesaw State, Milton Overton. And so he went to Texas A&M for 2 years, did not really do a whole lot, ended up transferring to Alabama back in December, thinking he was going to play for Nick Saban. A couple weeks later, Saban's gone. He's actually playing a different spot than he would have in Saban's defense, but he's starting to show up. He's got a lot of talent playing that bandit, kind of the 4-3 defensive end in Kane Womack's defense. And he's big enough to hold up against the run, and he's doing some stuff against the pass too. So he's the guy to watch. I think he has the best chance to be that disruptive player. But the front 7 overall, I would still, against the run, they didn't look great against Wisconsin or USF. And I think just that ability to make that big play, affect the pass, affect the quarterback is still a question for me.
Yeah, with LT Overton, this is not a surprise when we talk about some of those other guys. Another guy Georgia recruited really, really hard. I mean, you look at these two programs, there's a lot of recruiting battles. And again, with LT Overton, wasn't one that either one of these teams won initially, but obviously a big get for Alabama getting him out of the portal. We're going to take a quick break, come back, and talk specifically about this matchup, what we're hearing about the two teams getting ready for this game, and give some predictions on how it's going to play out. Well, Mike, looking at this game on Saturday, let's start on the injury front. And I will say this for the folks who are listening to this after the fact: we are recording this on Thursday afternoon, so there's going to be 2 or 3 availability reports before we wind up getting to the game, so things can change. But what is the latest on the injury front for Alabama? Any names to look out for on that in that part of the conversation?
Alabama's very healthy, and that's something that Kalen DeBoer and also Courtney Morgan, their new GM, have mentioned. Like, they're remarkably healthy. For a team at this point in the year, you're usually expecting there to be a big injury or two, and they've avoided that, which is probably partly just good medicine and good training, but some of that's just luck. So they're going into this game with only 3 guys on the injury report as of Wednesday, and that's Quay Rusaw, who's really come into his own and potential starter at Wolf linebacker, which is kind of the outside guy. Second-year guy. He's coming off an injury that he sustained in that Wisconsin game, but he's probable. Jeremiah Alexander is a backup linebacker who hasn't played the first 3 games, but he's probable for this game as well. Could maybe be a special teams guy. And then Richard Young is their 3rd running back. He's also probable. He had left that Wisconsin game, and he might get some carries in this game, but I would assume it's going to be mostly Miller and Haynes either way. So they're not a team that's affected by injury. Like I said, Malachi Moore is not even on the injury report. He cleared the concussion protocol. Cole Adams, who's kind of their 4th receiver, smaller slot guy, also a punt returner. He should be back. He had an elbow injury that he sustained in that South Florida game a couple weeks ago. So there's not much. I mean, unless there's something late in the week here that crops up, I would expect Alabama to be basically 100% healthy coming in here.
Definitely a good situation from Alabama's standpoint. The latest for Georgia, running back Roderick Robinson, receiver London Humphreys, right guard Tate Ratledge are out. Defensive end Michael Williams, wide receiver Sokobe White, defensive tackle Jordan Hall, questionable. Defensive tackle Warren Brinson, probable. Sounds like Brinson will be back, which will be helpful for this defensive line. And we're kind of waiting to see with Michael Williams. I've said this over on the board on the Junkyard. I think Michael's going to make the trip. I think he's going to play, but I think he'll probably play situationally. Still dealing with an ankle injury that he sustained in week 1 against Clemson. So this defensive line for Georgia may be shorthanded, and even if it's not shorthanded, probably not going to be 100%. So that will be something to watch on Saturday night. Now, Mike, when you look at talking to Kalen DeBoer this week, talking to the assistant coaches, talking to players about this matchup, about Georgia, what sort of stood out to you? What do you feel like you've heard from the different folks just getting ready for what they know is going to be a really big game on Saturday night?
Well, it's nice to talk to the assistants for starters. That's, like I said, something we didn't get under Nick Saban. So it's different around here in that we get to request assistant coaches and we get to talk to them. So that's nice. But yeah, it's something where I think there's not a huge familiarity with Georgia because Kalen DeBoer hasn't played them. Most of his coaching staff, there's Freddie Roach and Robert Gillespie, who are holdovers from the previous Alabama staff. They obviously know that. Christian Robinson, the former Georgia linebacker, is the outside linebackers coach for Alabama. Other than that, there's not a ton of familiarity, and that could go both ways. I think, they don't know Georgia, but Georgia also doesn't know them. And I think there could be some element of holding back these first 3 weeks, some things, and being able to throw some new looks to Georgia in this 4th game. And I think that's probably a tricky thing for Kirby when he's sitting down and trying to figure out, what am I supposed to see here? Like, he needs to go back and look at Washington. Like I said, this is not really 100% Washington's offense. This is not exactly what Alabama was running last year either. And what they have shown through the first 3 games is probably limited, especially those, the first and third games that were kind of blowouts. So I think there's some level of appreciation, from Alabama that they can put something new out there and maybe catch Georgia off guard. And I think it's just, they're trying to play it even keeled. Like, they understand this is only September. There's a long season ahead, and no matter how this game goes, if they beat Georgia, they still have to go to Tennessee in a couple weeks. They still have a lot of big games ahead. It's not, you're not haven't accomplished a ton by beating Georgia in September, in terms of your overall season. But if you lose the game, the same thing's true. I mean, you still have a lot of opportunities going forward. And I think it's a lot of this is just the SEC opener. This is just another game. I think there's a decent amount of that. But also an understanding that it's Georgia and, it's kind of a budding rivalry, and they want to show that they are still Alabama, kind of despite the doubts of this offseason. So it's a mix of trying to downplay it, but also, realizing that it's still a pretty big game.
Yeah, we do not get the assistant coaches in Athens. Kirby very much kind of follows the Nick Saban game plan. We get them in fall camp, and then we won't get them again unless Georgia makes the playoff. And, to the point about the lack of familiarity, I thought this was really interesting from Kirby talking about Kalen DeBoer, basically when he became aware of him. And he said, essentially when Dan Lanning got the Oregon job, and he's kind of following Dan and seeing how he does that first year in 2022. And then Washington keeps popping up. I can't remember if that was the year they played them twice, but they definitely at least played once. And that was sort of Kirby's introduction to Kalen DeBoer. And we'll get a chance to see them face off on Saturday. Now, Mike, when you look at this game, let's say things go well for Alabama, they keep it close, or they win this thing. What has to go right for the Crimson Tide to have a chance in this game?
It's definitely turnovers, and that's something, DeBoer mentioned on his SEC call this week, is Georgia's not going to turn the ball over. It's going to be hard to force turnovers from them. They're just not an offense that typically does that. I do think Alabama's defense wants to turn it over. That's kind of their whole swarm D mentality that Kane Womack has brought from Indiana, where he was the DC, and then South Alabama, where he was the head coach. They're going to be aggressive. They're going to try to strip the ball. They're going to, try to jump some routes and get some interceptions that could backfire. It's going to be a more aggressive defense than what Saban's had, but they want to force turnovers, but they understand Georgia is not, prone to those. And then offensively, it's protecting the ball themselves. I mean, they had a pretty sloppy game 2 weeks ago in South Florida. Jaylen Milroe had a fumble. Milroe had a fumbled snap. There was a fumble on the kick return from Kendrick Law. And they still won the game despite having a -3 turnover ratio, which there's very little chance of that happening against Georgia. And I think they understand that. So it's going to start with that. And, Jaylen Milroe has done a very good job of protecting the ball through the air, at least with his interceptions. He hasn't thrown an interception since the Kentucky game last November. And he's up to 146 passes in a row now without an interception, which is, I think, 11th best in program history for Alabama, and kind of moving his way up the chart there. So that's, again, it's different than what we saw out of him last year when he was forcing some balls in some tight windows. And if he can keep doing that and protecting the ball, even if you're not able to make those big plays down the field, I think that's a better formula for Alabama than trying to just sling it around and kind of be reckless. So that's what won them the game last year. I mean, Milroe's stats last year, 13 of 23, less than 200 yards, 29 rushing yards, was sacked, I think, 6 times. Like, they weren't great, but you know what? The best stat for Alabama last year was they didn't turn the ball over. And that was huge for them in that game. And I think it will be in this game as well.
Yeah, and you look at that game, a lot of Georgia fans go back to Georgia's fumble on a trick play that, again, turnovers are killer in a game that came down to one possession then and very well could on Saturday again. All right, Mike, how does this thing play out? Give us what you think you're going to see and a score prediction.
Yeah, I mean, I try not to make kind of rash judgments based on one game. So I know a lot of the national feeling around this game has changed since because of the last time these two teams played. I'm talking about when Georgia played Kentucky and they didn't look great. When Alabama played Wisconsin, they did look great. you asked that same question a week earlier. Alabama's coming off that South Florida win. Georgia's 2 weeks off of that Clemson win. I think people say Georgia comes in and steamrolls Alabama, or looks really good at least. And then everything kind of changed, because Georgia didn't look great. Alabama looked great. Now people say it's Alabama. I try not to play, the every week different feeling sort of game. I'm going to stick with my guns here. And Georgia fans will be happy because I picked Georgia to win 23-17 or 23-16, I should say. And what I think is going to be a lower scoring game. I think it's going to be more of a ball control game. And ultimately, for me, it comes down to something that Kane Womack himself said this week, which is Georgia's staff. And it's, there's been changes, obviously, but it's still that program, that philosophy, that scheme has been in place now for 8 or 9 years. And this is their first year of this coaching staff. There's a lot of new players. There's a new scheme on both sides, and it's still early in their first season. And to expect, to beat the number 1/2 team in the country that early, and sort of what's a rebuild on the fly, if you will, a reloading on the fly, that's tough to do. And I think Kalen DeBoer has tried to kind of nudge people to realize that in some ways. He's mentioned it on his radio show that this is still a work in progress for us. And that's kind of where I go with this game is, Mike Bobo's an experienced coordinator. Carson Beck's a really experienced, very good quarterback. And Kane Womack is still kind of new at this, on the defensive side. He has, again, a couple pieces on defense that I think can be exploited. And that's kind of the matchup to me is what Mike Bobo and Beck have kind of cooked up here over not just the last 2 weeks, but I'm sure the last 8 months to kind of attack this defense, and how well Kane Womack on the fly can adjust to it is going to be a big story for me.
Well, Mike, I'm glad I let you lead with your prediction, especially for the Georgia fans listening. I've got Alabama 23-20. I kind of have gone back and forth with, do you overreact from the Kentucky game? Do you just say it was a bad week on the road? But, the fact that this game's on the road, the fact that Jaylen Milroe's back, the fact that, my biggest questions lie on the Georgia offense. And really, for me, it's more so with the wide receivers. I felt like in the Kentucky game, just kind of lacking, perimeter blocking. Seemed like they really struggled getting open downfield. I think this is going to be a close game. I think Georgia very well does have a chance to win it. But you factor that in. You factor in breaking in a new right guard with Tate Ratledge out. I think that is going to hurt. And then again, trying to stop Brian Williams and trying to contain Jaylen Milroe. I think Georgia's going to have an opportunity, but I just have too many questions based on what we saw against Kentucky. I'm taking Alabama 23-20. Ben Wolk took Alabama 27-24. Just, I guess, running back that SEC title game, exact same score. And Kip Adams is going to make the Georgia fans happy. He's got Georgia 28-24. But I think we can all agree. I think this sets up to be a really entertaining game. Feels like, to me, definitely the best game of Week 5, but could be the best matchup we've seen to this point in the season.
Yeah, I think so too. It's going to be a good game, and it's kind of what I say is we don't watch the games because we think we know what's going to happen. We watch the games because we don't know what's going to happen, and that's kind of the fun part of it. That's why this game is going to do huge ratings. That's why there's all sorts of different celebrities going to this game, and it's the fun part of covering a game like this is you sit down and you don't know what's going to happen. And this is high level college football. I'd watch this game 10 times a year. I'd much rather do this than cover an Alabama Western Kentucky game. I'm sure you'd rather do this than cover a Georgia Tennessee Tech game. Like, this is what college football should be about. And hopefully we continue to get more of these.
The two extremes in our YouTube comments, G-Dog forever. When you consider everything, it seems it's almost a guarantee that Bama will win. And then on the other side, Ryan Flanagan says UGA is winning this matchup. So somewhere in between is probably the truth, and it's going to be an exciting one. Well, Mike, I appreciate you popping on. Thanks so much for taking the time. I want to give you the opportunity to plug what you're working on over at Bama 24/7. Let the folks know what they can check out getting ready for this game.
Yeah, bunch of stuff we have up on Thursday here, with Jaylen Milroe. I talked to some NFL people to kind of get a sense of where he's at, in terms of an NFL prospect, what he has to do better. And there's definitely things that he needs to improve on. Alex Scarborough did a position-by-position breakdown of Alabama versus Georgia. Those are always fun to see who you think has the better position groups. And Cody Goodwin's actually on some basketball coverage for us because Alabama has potentially the number one team in the country in basketball that just started practice this week. So it's that time of the year where things get pretty busy, and basketball has never been a bigger deal in Tuscaloosa than it will be this year.
For sure. And I'd also plug the Roll Pod podcast that you guys got. I popped on over there with Cody and had a chance to talk about this matchup and sort of give more of the Georgia perspective on what we're expecting to see. So we'll wrap up the episode right there. Thanks to everyone who watched this live, everyone who is watching or listening to it after the fact. Be sure to go subscribe to Dawgs247.com. Go subscribe to Bama247.com if you're a big Alabama fan. Go to the Dawgs247 YouTube, the TikTok. Got all kinds of good videos, all good content on there as we get ready for this big matchup. So for Mike Rodak, I'm Jordan Hill. Until next time, take care, everybody.